a bit of a presentation from our head of politics, telling us a little bit about what goes on outside the Westminster bubble and what does the public actually think about the Conservative Party. And then we've got a fabulous panel lined up for you as well, where we're going to discuss what Gideon presents, but also any of the questions that you might have as well. So just to introduce the panel, I will do that one at a time when we get into the session. So firstly, we have Gideon Skinner, who, as I say, is the head of politics at Ipsos. Gideon, what does the public think?
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. I won't stand, so you can concentrate on the stuff on the screen. So apologies for usual holster death by PowerPoint, but I hope there's lots of interesting data in there for you, and you can get in contact with us afterwards if you want any of this data. It's from a range of polling we've done, including over recent weeks. So I want to start just by thinking about, the old line, a year is a long time in politics. I remember speaking at our events to conference last year, and just thinking about maybe how the political situation has changed over the last 12 months. Back then, we were seeing signs of midterm blues. We were seeing the unwinding of the vaccination honeymoon, for example, but there was still a small lead for the Conservatives, pretty much neck and neck on Best Prime Minister. Around about half of the public saying they were dissatisfied with the government, which wasn't sort of unusual for a midterm government. But where are we now? And even before the last couple of weeks, we were seeing a fairly clear Labour lead. We were seeing Labour and Keir Starmer taking a lead on the most preferred Prime Minister amongst the public. Not quite as big a lead as he had over Boris Johnson's last couple of months, but nevertheless, a bit of a lead there. And growing dissatisfaction with the government being the kind of the legacy that Liz Truss and the new Prime Minister was coming into. And of course, can't really ignore the elephant in the room, which I will come back to, but there have been some pretty dramatic changes over the last week, which I'm sure you will all be well aware of in terms of the polling. Which these may be short-term changes. We need to see if it is just a temporary reaction, but if they last, can't get away from the fact that does not bode well if they were repeated in an election campaign. And just looking at that lead in a little bit of more detail, is there a chance you might be saying to yourselves that the Labour lead is just soft? And we're just losing some of our 2019 voters, and maybe they'll come back to us. So there are some signs of that. I mean, it is pretty clear, just if you look at our polls, if you take an aggregate of our polls over the last few months, Labour voters from 2019 are more enthusiastic. I say they're more likely to vote than Conservative voters, and that does play to some extent into the voting intention figures. But it's not just a lack of enthusiasm. There are switchers as well who you have to be particularly worried about, because they are much less likely to come back. Once they've switched, they tend to be sticky. If someone's a don't know or an undecided, they may come back. But a switcher is less likely to return, and the proportion of switchers that we're seeing at the moment is in the ballpark of the proportion of switchers that we saw going from Labour to the Conservatives before the 2010 election, which is not the happiest precedent for you. But we're coming in a new era. We have a new Prime Minister, but Liz Truss is coming in at a difficult time. She's picking up a difficult legacy. We know that sort of the mood in general is pessimistic. So just over half of people say they think the country is heading in the wrong direction. It's not quite as bad as it was in August, but it's still higher than we were seeing for most of the period since 2019. And we know what the public is worried about. It's very clear, the big issues. This is our issues index. It started nearly 50 years ago on the very month that I was born, and we haven't seen concern about inflation that high for 40 years or more. This is a new concern for the public, and it's very clear that they are worried about it. They're worried about energy bills, they're worried about mortgages, they're worried about rent. But it's not just cost of living and the economy that people are concerned about. We see concern about climate change, we see concern about public services, particularly the NHS. And if we take a look back at how the public scorecard for the Boris Johnson government, there were some successes. Public positive about his handling of Ukraine in particular, about vaccinations and about generally the response to COVID. But elsewhere, not just on the economy, there was more criticism, and particularly standing out in terms of concern over the NHS, concern over cost of living, which I mentioned, and concern over immigration. Immigration and crime actually being particular concerns for Conservative supporters. So this is a situation that the new Prime Minister has come into, and we can kind of see her sort of first month scores, her kind of honeymoon scores, compared to previous Prime Ministers. We've been tracking this since the 1970s. We don't quite have, slightly annoyingly for Margaret Thatcher, we don't have it for a first month. We've got it for her sort of like a second month or something. So we haven't put Margaret Thatcher on it. But you can see Liz Truss starts with around 4 in 10 saying they don't know, the public sitting on the fence about her. So scope for it to move either way, but maybe not quite as positive as most other new Prime Ministers, reflecting that difficult legacy that she's coming into. Not that dissimilar to the figure that Boris Johnson started, and of course he then went on to win the 2019 election, but maybe the wider circumstances are not so favourable to Liz Truss. And she's also facing a need to rehabilitate the Conservative brand, which I will come back to, but on a number of ratings, Labour generally scores better, and on things like whether people think the Conservative Party keeps its promises, is fit to govern, looks after the interests of people like me, has a good team of leaders, understands the problems facing Britain. Some of these scores are the lowest we've seen for a decade or more for the Conservatives, which reflects the difficult times you've been having under the previous Prime Minister and concerns around delivery on cost of living and public services. And this was before, I should say, this was still under Boris Johnson. We're going to have some new figures shortly on what this is like for the Conservatives under Liz Truss, but it shows the need to rehabilitate the brand. But as I mentioned, we also just have to talk about the last week. It's if a year is a long time in politics, then the last week has been even longer. We sort of see this reflecting there's sort of the general mood of the public, concern about the economy, 8 in 10 thinking that the economy is poor. And in terms of who they hold responsible for that, the public aren't daft. They know that there are global external factors, particularly things like Ukraine and the overall state of the economy. But the blame placed on government's economic policies is increasing. And the trouble is, for the Prime Minister and the new Chancellor, that this hasn't helped with the public's first impressions of them. We haven't really seen much of a honeymoon period. You know, you've seen that. So around about half are critical, and that's, for Liz Truss, that's not hugely better really than where Boris Johnson was in his last few months. And for the Chancellor, that's actually not quite as good as Rishi Sunak was getting at the time of his spring statement earlier this year. And for all the talk about individual policies, what this is leading to is a lack of confidence in the public about the Conservatives' long-term economic plans. If I you can go back and look and see what happened, for example, in the 2010-2015 period, sort of 2010 to 2012, you had the omni-shambles budget. There was lack of confidence in Osborne and Cameron then, but you saw that turn round. The sort of that long-term economic plan mantra got through to the public, and they won that argument. But you're starting in a difficult position
now. Similarly, the idea that the Conservatives provide Britain with strong and stable leadership is not one that is widely held amongst the public at large. And you can compare that with Keir Starmer, who I'll come on to Labour, but he had a good conference. Still early days, we need to test all this and see how long it's going to last, but you can see the proportion of people thinking that he's likely to be the next Prime Minister or likely to be Prime Minister is now about half, and that's gone up over the last couple of months. Which does bring us to Labour, if we're talking about your position and looking ahead to the next general election. Of course, there's two or more parties in this. Labour's position is clear. They're in a stronger position than they have been for some time. Some of the old doubts on leadership, they've neutralised. Keir Starmer had a clear lead over Boris Johnson as preferred Prime Minister, a slightly more marginal one, but still one over Liz Truss, that neither of his predecessors ever saw. Put that into a bit of context, his overall ratings, though, were still pretty lukewarm. His average satisfaction as leader of the opposition is only really in line with the average that we've seen for leaders of opposition since 1979, and we know that most of them go to lose. It's not as bad as Jeremy Corbyn's worst scores, but it's definitely a long way from the ratings that successful opposition leaders were having, like Tony Blair and David Cameron. So he's still not quite sealed the deal. We need to see if he gets a bump after conference, his conference or not. And they do have a long way to recover. We've seen in the past, and I've been polling for a long time, large mid-term leads don't always mean that you win the next election, but they're definitely hard to overturn. The extent of the leads at the moment are hard to overturn. It feels like it is, unlike last year, it feels like it is a bit more than just your standard midterm blues at the moment, even if there is some recovery. But it's probably also still the case that as much of this is about Conservative troubles as Labour strengths. So if we ask whether you think the different parties are fit to govern, this is a figure for Labour, and basically it's 1 in 3, and that's barely changed. It's been the same throughout Ed Miliband, throughout Jeremy Corbyn, and now under Keir Starmer. The issue is that this is what's happened to the Conservative score. And that's probably one of the challenges that you need to try to turn around. So where does that all leave us? So just thinking about where we might go in the future. We can see the contours of a general election campaign, the key issues. We can see even before the last couple of weeks, Labour were, as they always are, they're ahead on the NHS. They're actually more trusted on levelling up as well. They did own the cost of living policy area. They were more trusted on cost of living. But just a couple of weeks ago, which wasn't that long ago, the Conservatives were still the most trusted on growth. So if you asked me a couple of weeks ago, I would have said that would be the key argument. Can you take control and make the economic agenda about growth, which is where the public are more favourable towards you than just around the cost of living? So where does that all leave us? And then we'll let the panel go on to talk about it. How do you turn around this immediate reaction to the budget, which hasn't been the most positive? You are, so if that's exactly. If Kwasi Kwarteng can do understatement, so can I. You're clearly facing a stronger opponent, although there are still doubts. There are still doubts about Labour's readiness for government. Now, people are pretty split on that, and they're still a long way from, as I said, Cameron or Blair in terms of some of those ratings. What will appeal to your 2019 coalition? How do you keep that? There's obviously been lots of discussion about that at conference, but probably looking ahead, delivery on the economy is still going to be key. Everything that's happened over the last couple of weeks probably only makes that even more important. So can you win that argument on growth? Because that's likely to be crucial to your prospects for next year. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gideon. So quite a bit to digest there. And in my excitement earlier to tell you that the bar was closing, I forgot to tell you who I was. So I'm Kelly Beaver, and I lead Ipsos in the UK and Ireland. So I'm the chief executive. And I am delighted to introduce Damian Collins, who's MP for Folkstone and Hythe, and also the Minister for Tech and Digital Economy. And I will ask each of our panellists in turn, starting with Damian, to tell us a little bit about what they made of what they just heard and any reflections before I open the floor for questions. So Damian, over to you first.
So I would recommend everyone, if they haven't already done it, buys a book from Amazon, which is called Thatcher's Trial, and is written by Kwasi Kwarteng. And it's the kind of history of 1981, the year when, everyone, the Conservative Party was massively divided. No one thought lots of people didn't think Margaret Thatcher was equipped to be Prime Minister. They thought the government's economic strategy was completely flawed. The 100 economists wrote in at the time saying that, they don't know what they're doing. He wrote the book, analysing that year as the year that made her. Actually, she saw through that difficult period of time, was vindicated, and then won a massive landslide majority 2 years later. So I think the thing the government's doing at the moment is, I think when new leaders come in, I think it's particularly important for leaders of the opposition. When new leaders come in, they have to set out really quickly what it is they believe and what they want to do. I think regardless of what you think of, whether you're Conservative, hopefully most of you are Conservative supporters as a Conservative Party conference, but no one would say Liz has not been really clear about what she thinks is important and what they're going to do. They have done something very radical and a big departure in terms of saying we need a growth strategy that's going to work. We need to be much more ambitious about that. Global economy is going through a difficult period of time. We need to make the UK the most attractive place to come and do business, and we've got to support people through a fuel crisis that is linked to the war in Ukraine. So I think they've been really clear, and I think the advantage that will come with that is that what I'd see from that polling is inflation in the economy is the number one issue, and people don't necessarily think the problems that we have in the economy are the government's fault. They're more likely from the research to think it is to do with the global economy or the war. So if you're the government, you can come in and say, okay, so what we're doing is we're head on trying to deal with the things you're most worried about. You don't necessarily blame us for the fact there's a problem. And if we can solve that problem, then what you would hope is the government will be in a good position, that the public can see we're doing it, they'll recognise we do it, and if we're right, then what I would expect will happen is the public will think the government has done a good job. To solve the problem. And if we went into the next general election with inflation back within target range, strong growth, maybe stronger growth in other G7 countries, the war in Ukraine resolved, you think the government could go into that election with quite a strong platform to say, look, we did these things, everyone told us we were wrong, we've been proven right, we've fixed the problem, and now we are equipped to govern. And I think in parallel to that, I think the problem that Labour still have is that nobody, other than the fact Keir Starmer wants to be Prime Minister, what else does he want? Everyone wants, what specifically would Labour do? Do they have policies that are eye-catching and imaginative? And I think one of the dangers for the politicians have sometimes is we think the public are desperate to find out what we're doing. They're desperate to make their mind up about us. Often on the whole, people are quite happy leaving you in the box they put you in and never looking in it again. And I sort of feel that's the challenge Labour have, is that Liz Truss has articulated a very clear position of what she thinks and what she wants to do. People agree with it, people disagree with it, but it's clear. And I don't think Labour have done that. And I think for leaders of the opposition, if you don't really do that in your first year or two, it's very hard to do it later on. And obviously the pandemic and other things have made it particularly difficult for Labour. But if you look at, say, Tony Blair, he was really clear from the start that how he was different and why he was different and what he would do. And that, I think, was why he was so successful. And Labour haven't done that. So I think for the government, the success of the next election will depend on whether the policies we've set out in the last couple of weeks work. And if they work, I think we will win.
So very clear from Damian on the direction of travel. So I'm going to ask Matthew Holehouse, who is the British political correspondent of The Economist and probably well known to many of you in the room. Certainly I read all of your stuff, Matthew. Who's going to give us his reflections just on some of Gideon's data, and feel free to comment on Damian's comments as well if you'd like. You've got 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you, yeah. And thank you very much for having me. It's amazing research. I guess my comments do actually sort of follow on quite neatly from Damian's, which is, I guess the challenges that we're seeing at the moment for the Conservative Party really reflect a sort of an essay question, provide as an answer to an essay question, which is how many times can a party reinvent itself with a new leader and a new agenda whilst holding power. And that is something that actually the Conservative Party have done with spectacular success. The anticipating when it has been losing the support and the patience of the public, installing new leaders, installing new agendas. It worked quite well from David Cameron to Theresa May to Boris Johnson. The shift from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss has self-evidently not been successsill. Now, the risk that she's running, I think, that is borne out by the polling, is that she is at risk of walking away from two planks of the Johnson project, which were enormously electorally successful. One was this idea of a more interventionist state, the tradition of sort of dirigism, the levelling up agenda, much more relaxed attitude about state intervention in industry and so on, married to fiscal discipline and sound economic management. This was the sort of the Boris and the Rishi's show, and that's a very old formula, right? You know, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did the same thing, and one legitimises the other. You can only do Johnsonism because you have the reassurance provided by Sunakism, and that agenda had tensions. It always does have tensions. The danger for this administration is that they have surrendered both the Johnsonomics agenda, which was popular in the Red Wall with astonishing results in 2019, but they've also abandoned the Sunak agenda, so that you see the concurrence of both a surrendering of economic competence through the misfiring of the budget. We could talk about reasons why that might be and whose fault that would be, but that certainly it does look like the upshot of that, and at the same time pivoting to a project which, whatever one might say about the necessity of doing something quite radical to lift the UK's growth prospects, which is actually something that the Economist has been advocating for some time. So we're must keen on supply side reform. Actually, the polling on actually how much people are itching for that as opposed to something else is in doubt. So that's the danger for the party. Now the flip side to that is, and again this is borne out by the polling, that the difficulty of reinvention is demonstrating to people that you're a new party, right? That this is a new government. And this is something that Boris Johnson did to extraordinary effect. So people looked at the Conservative Party in 2019 as a wholly new enterprise. This was year zero. Now the question is this administration managing to do that? Now, some of the external trappings of that are the attempt is there clearly with the new agenda, new personnel, new language, new sort of style and trappings. But a lot of the difficulties of the Johnson era that actually led to the downfall of Johnson are evidently still there in terms of party management, in terms of collective cabinet response. Sorry, it's been a long few days. Collective cabinet responsibility, in terms of the tendency that even I think Boris Johnson's best defenders would admit towards the sort of the policy made on heroic optimism, the risk of sort of things being announced perhaps before they're fully cooked. So those are the dangers, right, for the party, that it abandons the things that were good and popular about Johnsonism and actually retains some of the baggage, as we see that undermined it. And I'm still trying to understand what's happened in the polls, because clearly it would be surprising if at the next election the Labour Party are 33 points ahead. But I think the scale of the shock in the polls, that sort of explosive shift in support, is going to be people are going to be unpicking that for years to come. But I do wonder if perhaps actually some of the doubts that we were seeing in the public that sort of manifested through Partygate and manifested through the downfall of the Johnson era, and sort of just this general sense that the government needed to get itself together and focus on governing, maybe did they crystallise all at once actually, and that sort of a general anxiety about performance has manifested. So it's I think anybody who's covered or lived through or watched British politics for the past 10 years would know the dangers of trying to predict an election 2 years out. But I think what is apparent is that actually after 12 years the costs of governing do accumulate, and managing this refresh is very difficult. And that is, I guess my final thought is a word of warning for anybody who's planning any leadership plots, right? That it's very, very easy to change your leader. Actually, delivering that renewal and convincing the public that you have delivered that renewal is a very difficult achievement, and one that Boris Johnson managed to great success, but has proven a difficult act to follow.
So our final input is from Professor Maria Sobolewska, who is a Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester. And thank you, Maria, for being with us. So
thank you.
Tell us what you thought, and feel free to add comments on anything you've heard so far.
Yes, so I will be slightly more pessimistic, I'm afraid, in contrast to the first commentator here. And I think it is because I have just been, as a politics professor, been trying to unpack and analyse and explain Brexit. I've written an excellent book on it, Brexitland, in all good bookshops. And one of the things that we argued in Brexitland with my co-author has been that party reputations matter a lot. And they actually matter more than parties often assume. The kind of party brand that you all work so hard to create actually sticks with voters. And voters are often low information, and they will use that brand. They will use the reputation that you've built over decades and decades. And one of the things that was really noticeable about the run-up to Brexit is that the Conservative Party lost one of its main bits of the brand, which was that it was a party of immigration, party that was competent and able to stop and help control immigration, right? And that had real consequences because, of course, this was the bit that enabled the emergence and great success of UKIP, and therefore implying, putting that pressure on the party that led finally to this fateful referendum. However, of course, there were sources that benefited from that loss of reputation on immigration, actually created something that was extra to our usual electoral cycles. And as a result, then after Brexit referendum has happened, the Conservative Party was able to still benefit from Brexit by occupying that position, becoming the party of leave. However, once the party loses its second most big, like the biggest part of the brand, which is that they are good at economic management, and that is super important for the reputation and the brand of the Conservative Party, and has been from the beginning. It was a party of government, the managerial, competent party of government. If you lose that, you don't create a beneficiary outside of elections. You give that advantage to your main opponent. It will go to Labour. And therefore, it is the most important thing, and almost the only thing, as I would argue, to tackle as a Conservative Party right now. So I do agree with my predecessors here. The economy will be how you will win or lose the next election. The reason why I mentioned immigration and that loss of reputation is because I do think there are some lessons to be learned from that experience. What has gone wrong? Why did you lose that reputation? And can you avoid it next time round? So the first and the foremost and the most obvious is don't make promises that you can't keep. And I think this is something that would speak to the speed with which the Conservative Party is trying to put forward new plans to try to make that mark of new leader and new chancellor. Actually, that is an extremely risky strategy, and it really smacks very similar to this unfortunate pledge on immigration that Cameron kind of delivered a bit off the cuff, and then it haunted him for the rest of his administration, and arguably was one of the proximate causes of Brexit. If you promise something you can't deliver, people will remember, people will remind you, the press will certainly remind multiple times the voters that you've not delivered, so don't do that. It's better not to panic than to do something like that. A kind of related one is to try not to, I call it don't flog a dead horse, but I think it's to speak to trying to mobilize into politics issues that are not active with voters, okay? And one of the big kind of strategies, and I think that has started more recently, become more important because of the 24-hour media cycle, that distraction issues are very popular with political parties and administrations. You know, if you have some bad news coming on one of the main issues, you just throw something else as a distraction. But the truth is that you cannot activate an issue. You can only mobilize an issue. The voters have to care about it to start with. And the truth is, and this, in fact, is speaking more to last administration than this one, but the last administration was trying to excite voters about things they weren't excited about. They kept banging on about immigration. Voters have moved on. They were trying to create this whole hoopla about war on woke. voters don't really care about that. So don't do that. Do think about economy. Do try to do something about economy, and don't try to distract voters because you can't do it. And finally, the kind of, this is, I guess, the pessimistic bit, is that when we think about the economy, we often, because you are really political elites of this country, right? You are already an extremely politically engaged group of people. Some of you have had the experience of running the party, running bits of government or non-governmental organizations. When you think about voters, they are much lower information and much lower engagement. And so when they judge economy, they don't think like an economist. They literally look at themselves, their own families, their own friends, their neighborhoods, okay? And the problem that the Conservative Party has with their economic plans, and they might be extremely ambitious and even successful, perhaps in the long term, is that the Conservative Party doesn't have a long term, okay? You have 2 years left, and a lot of those very grand economic ideas of trickle down and growth, how quickly will those translate into your voters having more money in their pocket than they had before? This is, I think, the biggest challenge for the party. And I think the main lesson to learn from this immigration debacle, again, because Cameron promised a very long-term reduction of immigration, but he couldn't deliver it at all. He couldn't renegotiate anything with the EU in the short term, and voters just lost patience with him. So be wary of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So some slightly different perspectives from each of our panellists, and we will open the floor for discussion now. So you can have comment, keep your comment tight if you can, or questions for the panellists. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask. We don't have microphones, we're just going to talk loudly. So those questions, just to recap, are the members and the party voters just feeling fatigued because Conservatives have been in government too long and the rate of change is too high? Second question about the Prime Minister and whether a change of Prime Minister would help better at the next election. Young people's vote, and what should the Conservative Party try to help enhance the number of young people who vote and vote for them? And secondly, the flip-flopping on climate-related policies, and just some commentary on that. So who would like to start, Damian?
Okay. Too long in power. I think a consequence of changes of leadership during this period of office, I think, is that the government is actually far more refreshed than it might otherwise be. I think the fatigue really sets in where you've got the same people. I think with Gordon Brown, I think that was a problem for him because he'd been Chancellor and Prime Minister for 13 years. And I think there is a slight danger people just get bored of you. And the other slight danger that can come of that is that you yourself, you think you're right on everything. You've been in power if you're Gordon Brown, you've been Chancellor and you're Prime Minister. You have it's very difficult, I think, for parties in that position to be receptive to new ideas, or to be a receptive idea that maybe the public's attitudes about some things have changed during the time you've been in power. And I think we don't have that problem, because we have not. There's not a kind of like path. There's not been an orthodoxy on everything that we're doing, and there's been a big change in people and faces. The question is, are we doing a good job? Are we a competent administration? Do people have trust in the cabinet and in the Prime Minister for doing it? But I think this does feel, and it felt this certainly with Boris as well, like the start of a new government. And I think actually the virtue in taking some quite bold measures very quickly, I think rather than make it look like we're sort of jumping around, it does make it feel like a new administration. There's a break from the past, and this is something new. And I think the next general election, we will very much be judged on these 2 years rather than the previous, the whole length of the period in which we've been in government. So I think, I think as we've sort of all sort of agreed, really, I think it does rest on if we get the economy right, the government's in a good position. But I think, and actually that is, I think, a much stronger position than when we lost to Labour in '97. Where actually we did fix the economy. The economy was doing really, really well. But actually, the issue then was, as Tony Blair has said, actually what people wanted was more investment in public services, but they didn't want to risk the economy in the process of doing it. So, this time around, actually, if we're the party that is seen to be delivering on the thing everyone is most concerned about at the moment, then that I think that gives us a real chance of doing well at the next election. I think we have to. I think the idea of having another leadership election is just crazy. And again, I think if Liz's strategy is correct, I think she will receive a lot of personal credit for it as well, because I think what people can see now is she's really stuck her neck out on this. She really thinks it's the right thing to do. She's prepared to face down critics. I think you get a sense of her as that someone, she thinks about what she believes in. She says what she believes in and she does it. And if that works, then that's great. So I think the idea of change now would be wrong. Just on young people in the Conservative Party, I feel like I've been having this conversation for the last 30 years, since I was a student. I think that I do. We want to secure support for everyone. I think actually, when you look at the red wall seats where we did well, I think we did do well amongst younger voters in those constituencies as well. And but I think there is still definitely a trend that as people get older, they tend to be more likely to vote Conservative, and that has continued. But I think the question really is, can we keep together the coalition of support that we got at the last general election that delivered us such a big majority? That I think is the most important challenge that we face. On climate change, fracking, I think these are important issues. I think people do care about the long-term health of the nation, and the climate is integral to that. But I think there is also a short-term concern at the moment around fixing the economy. But I think these longer-term issues around delivering net zero are important to people, and people want to see the government doing everything they can to meet those targets. But at this moment in time, you wouldn't. I think if you went to the electorate and say we want to increase energy levies because we think it's more important, we think it's really important now that we use less energy, I think people say, well, clearly this is not the right time to be doing that, even if we support the long-term target of achieving net zero. So I think it's dealing with the issue in hand, but not forgetting that people do think this is still very important. I think things like fracking, I think specific energy policies have really become a local issue. I think in particular, I think if you live in an area where there isn't going to be any fracking, I don't think it's something that you think about very much. If you do, then you might have a different view. I have a nuclear power station in my constituency. As a consequence, my constituents are incredibly pro-nuclear energy. Because if you try to take a nuclear power station to a community that's never had one before, you might get a different response.
Thank you, Damian. So, Maria, I'm going to ask you just to come in now a little bit. What's your view on the leadership shifting over the next couple of years?
Yes, I would definitely advise against having another one, for sure. But I must say that this was really interesting what Damian said about voter fatigue and whether voters do think that new leader is a new party and it's a renewal, or whether they just think the party cannot govern itself and it's in a bit of a disarray. And actually that would be an interesting question for Ipsos if there were any figures on that, because I do tend to think that voters are currently quite disengaged. And a lot of them, you probably know exactly how many, say there's no difference between parties. So how can they then tell the difference between Boris and Liz Truss if they can't even, if they don't perceive a difference between the two main parties?
Interesting on that question, this research, the Conservative Party seem to be more different than typical parties than the Labour Party is, which I think is a party in government this long is quite a strength.
They are. I think that's probably the bit that. Sorry, this is an internal panel conversation. do feel free to join in. I suppose that I'm not sure the extent to which the public paid its attention to party management, and that will, the key point is whether they think you are divided or not, and that has got worse for the Conservatives over the. It's not so specifically just right now, but over the last year or two, that perceptions of Conservatives being divided have increased. Whereas the thought that Labour was divided, which maybe you had pre-2019, that's gone down a bit. So that's the bit you want to worry about.
And Gideon, before we come to Matthew, just on the public concern about the climate, it came up in the top issues, but how does that compare when they're also very much concerned about inflation and cost of living? So,
Damian is right that there will be a slight crowding out effect. Right now, if you had to choose only one, then inflation and economy is what cost of living is what people are going to be concerned about. But for all that we are talking about delivering on the economy, it's also true of what Matthew was saying about some of the other aspects of the 2019 agenda, like investing in public services, just like climate change. They do continue to be concerns for people. NHS waiting lists are a big concern for people. And obviously, the idea is that you can build the economy so that you can continue investing in them. But there are a range of climate change, public services, the NHS in particular, are still on the government's plate.
Yeah. and they'll be latent and it'll pop up at times when things like the heat waves happened over the summer, or and similarly if there ends up being a winter election, things like the NHS become top of mind. So Matthew, just your thoughts on some of those questions?
Yes, so on churn, I mean, it's a really obvious point, but really worth stating is that, you know, whilst renewal is good because you renew yourself, you can sustain, you know, you can actually move ahead of the electorate, right? So that you change before change is forced upon you. You know, you almost render the electorate irrelevant by doing it yourself. Find a new prime minister if they don't leave it. Honestly, that has been the secret of Conservative success for 12 years. The price of that is delivery, right? Because actually, a combination of a change of agendas and actually, as we all know, at times gridlock in Parliament because Parliament was hung or because, you know, Boris Johnson had lost his authority, means that actually a lot of legislation that could and should have been passed and implemented and then delivered upon hasn't taken place. So, you know, to take the areas that Damian's now in charge of, and things will change now you're around. But you know, I remember being in Vietnam with David Cameron, taking briefings from him on online harms. Now the online harms bill is now, you know, on the cusp of being law perhaps, but you know, this was 7 years ago. Stuff like reform of GDPR and reform of the competition regime for digital giants, right? We were talking about this in 2016, and you know, obviously, you know, this stuff takes time because it's complicated. But you know, the more the party reinvents itself, actually is in tension with this stuff, particularly at levelling up, right? Because levelling up or you know, regional development policy or whatever you want to call it, actually to get results on the ground, you know, you're talking like 20 years of sticking at one policy. If you're talking about, you know, adult skills, really to make a tick of difference in your, productivity per head, right? And so if you're going to change your adult skills policy every year, that then is your growth issue, right? On the I can't remember who asked about the economy. Did somebody ask you about the economy?
It wasn't specifically about the economy. There were things about policies flip-flopping between climate and the economy, and I'll ask you about young voters at the end.
So I think the risk, and this again just feeds to the churn in the party, and when does renewal and churn become a liability? There is a risk that will manifest itself over the next 18 months, right? Because we all know that the next 18 months are going to be tough. Inflation, interest rates, very largely due to external factors, the war in Ukraine, but also possibly, you know, government action has contributed to inflation. If you then start having to take action to regain the confidence of the markets, and that involves tough decisions over do you go ahead with the budget as described? Do you go for further austerity? Do you pass the supply side reforms that you can then convince the people who lend Britain money that they're going to deliver the growth fast enough to fulfil the promise of growth to fund tax cuts? Whatever you do, right? Those are going to be A, politically difficult choices in Parliament, and B, all of those options are going to be unpopular at some point. And so this is where unpopularity of the government and perceptions of weakness of the government become difficult, because then you are at risk if the UK, let me stress, were the UK to be in that dynamic, which isn't a foregone conclusion, but if it were, the perception of unpopularity and weakness becomes dangerous, because that undermines your ability to take the actions that you need to sustain that credibility. This is the scenario that David Cameron was talking about, right, in 2010. So there is, you know, not only do tough economic circumstances, if they are perceived to be the government has contributed to them, not only does that drive the unpopularity of the government, but the unpopularity of the government can then hinder its ability to do the things it might possibly need to do in some scenarios. That is a really difficult dynamic.
So I'll come to more questions in a minute, so get your hands ready. But for now, I'm just going to ask for Maria's view on the young voters issue.
Yes, sorry, I skimmed about this before. So young voters are a very complicated issue because they have the reasons why they don't want to vote for the Conservatives in the proportions that we see amongst older voters are very complicated. So there's two kind of main ones. One is economic, and the other one is on values, political values. And I do think that The economic one is an interesting one because I think this is the one that when you first won in 2010, you were very aware of it, and there were some policies that were aimed at kind of rebalancing the books towards the younger generations a little bit, but that has been basically forgotten, and we've not heard any of these kind of initiatives for young parents and for generally younger people at all. And of course the biggest failure, but this is a failure of every political party in this country, tackling housing, right? This is something that definitely young voters would absolutely jump on if the Conservatives were to, in one policy that would actually help them buy a house. But the other one is on values, and what a lot of the last government war on woke, as they said it, described, a lot of these attitudes which felt very woke to the government, to the young people seemed very normal. And this is part of the problem that the government has with the universities, because the reasoning goes that the youngsters are so woke because the universities wokeify them. But the truth is that the youngsters also know that they need universities, because to get a good job and to progress in your careers, you increasingly need university education. So the war on universities and the war on woke is not helping Conservatives win any young voters, I don't think. So yeah, I would take a double tack with the youngsters, both soften this kind of culture wars narratives, but also do remember they need somewhere to live.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. You've all learnt a new word, wokeify. So our 4 questions then, and you can take them as you like. What does the demographic shift and the proportion of the population getting older mean for how people will vote and how Conservative Party needs to adapt? Proportional representation, what does that mean for the two-party system in the UK? What about the Lib Dems generally? And then the name of the party. Should the Conservative Party rebrand? Names on the back of a postcard. Okay. So we will start perhaps, Gideon, on the proportional representation, and then we'll move down, if that's okay.
I mean, so it's a very good question. I think it's really hard to tell because, you know, we can do all the hypothetical research, but, you know, when people are actually faced with a voting choice in a different way, how is that going to fall out? You expect it would, you know, despite the return of the sort of the two-party system over the last couple of years. So 5 years ago, we were all saying, you know, this is the end of two-party politics, and we've got fractionalisation and so on. I think underlying that, there is still the fractionalisation in the electorate, you know, whether that is by age or by education. You know, we're already seeing it sort of nationally. You see what's happening in Scotland is very different. So yeah, I think you would see you would see clear differences, but I would hate to predict what they were going to be. Frankly,
we pay you for this.
Yeah, it's okay. No, yeah, exactly.
It's okay.
No, I think you know, you expect it to a certain extent to sort of benefit the quote unquote progressive side. Forgive me if you want to take progressive for the Conservative side, but you know, there's very easy to point to, for example, the rise of UKIP which Maria will know, you know, in a proportional representation system 5 years ago, you know, UKIP would have been getting loads of seats. So it's sort of, you've got to kind of just not go in with unthinking assumptions of exactly how it would go.
Thanks, Gids. So, Damian, any thoughts on any of those questions? The demographic shift, the name of the party. Would you like a rebrand?
Well, I used to work, before I became an MP, I was, most of my career was in the advertising industry. I worked for Saatchi's, and we always used to say the last thing you should change is your name. You kind of change everything else first, and then when you change everything else, if the name doesn't fit with what you changed to, then change the name. So the idea of just like, if you change the name, it changes the values of the organisation or how it looks or feels or sounds, I think is wrong. I think it'd be a big mistake to change the name of the party. I'm not sure what we change it to. And actually, I think it's the personality of the leadership that actually set the personality for the party. I think the reason David Cameron, you know, managed to win was the fact that he was very clear he was a different sort of Conservative leader. He would reach audiences that would otherwise fail to reach in opposition, and would be an effective challenger to Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And I remember actually being in the hall at Blackpool where he gave his speech in that party conference just before the leadership election, and it was kind of a visceral moment of change. It was kind of like, we've been talking about how do we change the party to win, And it was kind of, okay, that's what it looks like. And it was, I think it was as simple as that when it happened. We had to be shown what it was. And I think, and you didn't need, I mean, he changed the logo of the party. I don't think these logo changes or name changes really mean very much. It's the personality of the leaders and what they stand for and what their values are that I think are the most important thing. I agree with the question. I think what's really interesting is that you raise a really important issue, which is obviously linked to cost of living, which is about the cost of people's mortgages, and it's a really direct cost. You know, a part of getting the economy right will be getting growth going, restoring confidence to the markets. So that actually it'll be the growth in the economy and the growth of revenues that will come that will help us bring public spending back in line with back in line with where it should be. And I think that will hopefully have a downward pressure on interest rates at that point. But it is going to be concerning for people. And I think inherent in your question as well is, in most general elections, I think one of the biggest dangers is less people switching from one party to another, it's people not voting. I think what we do, we canvass, we knock on doors, we're trying to drive differential turnout of our supporters in the election. And if our supporters just don't turn out, then that's a problem. And I think it is linked to cost of living, and you're right to raise it. On the voting system, the two things I thought of when you asked the question about that. Firstly, if we go into the next election and it looks quite close, I think it'll be interesting to see whether the factor returns that I think really damaged Labour in 2015, particularly in my seat in the south of England, which is the idea of Labour having to have some sort of an electoral pact with the SNP. I think the idea of Nicola Sturgeon pulling the strings, I think would be very, very toxic for Labour. And I think no matter how they cut it, even if they say there wouldn't be a formal coalition, I think it would be difficult for them. I also thought the other thing, my experience during the worst time of my 12 years in Parliament was the kind of period of the indicative votes, on the Brexit deal. Where the government couldn't get its deal through, the House couldn't agree on anything else, and you just felt the whole country getting more and more frustrated. And I think regardless of what academics think about the way politics should work, on the whole, the electorate's view is we elect a government to govern, and the idea of paralysis being a good outcome is not one in the public share. And I think if changing the voting system means like permanent coalitions, I think people accept a coalition for a short period of time, but not as a system of government. I don't think people like the idea. The Lib Dems really suffered because in government they didn't deliver what they said they would do in the election. I think if you have the idea that actually you just vote for a party and then once they're in power, once they're elected, they then decide behind the scenes what they're going to do things they never said they would do before. I don't think people like that. I think the only way we'd have a change in the voting system would be if they just did it without a referendum. I remember during the referendum on AV, in my constituents, most of the feedback was why are we doing this? Why are we changing? I think a bit like what Churchill said about democracy applies to our voting system. First past the post is the worst system apart from all the others. And I think if you say to people, well, I think people want an MP. They don't want just PR list. They actually want a named person who's their MP. I think people would agree with the idea that MPs should all be elected on the same basis. The idea of having some MPs that don't have constituencies and some that do, I don't think people would support. And with AV, what came up is the idea of some people get to vote more than once. Some people's vote is counted more than once, other people's only once. And how can that be fair? So when you start stress testing everything else, and I think if a new government came in and tried to force this change on the voters, I think that would be a mistake.
Thank you very much. So, Matthew, did either you or Maria go to the Lib Dem conference at all?
No, it was cancelled. It was cancelled.
It was cancelled.
Yes.
Are you going to go next year?
Absolutely. No. Absolutely.
Would you like to tell us how you think they will fare?
How will the Lib Dems fare? Can I say that? Just want to do the Lib Dems.
Yes.
Yeah. So Lib Dems actually answers the proportional. Do you need to change the voting system? If you are not a conservative, if you're not the Conservatives, evidently the answer is no, because what you're seeing in by-elections where Conservative incumbents have been challenged is that voters are getting very, very good at reading the signals on how to vote tactically, right? So you don't need some deal with a piece of paper and carving up of cabinet jobs and handshakes and that. Voters are taking cues. They know in this seat to vote Lib Dem, in this seat to vote Labour, if they don't want to vote Conservative. Right. I'm going to answer the Lib Dem question while also answering your question about rebranding the Conservative Party, because I think one of the things driving the success of the Lib Dems in some Conservative-facing seats is that actually the truth is over the past 6 years, the most Conservative party in British politics are the Liberal Democrats, right? Because for good or ill, and I don't make a comment, whether for either way. Actually, the Conservative Party have been embarking on some really, really radical projects of change, be that leaving the European Union, rethinking about how we, fund the BBC, rethinking the civil service, the judiciary, all the stuff that actually Dominic Cummings and Boris, Michael Gove and Policy Exchange have been interested for a long time. And naturally, actually, there is a chunk of the electorate that isn't that keen on that and feels that some of the institutions which they feel, Greenbelt actually is obviously key, right? There is a chunk of the electorate that feels kind of culturally estranged from this. They're not really happy with some of these changes. And the party that the two parties actually that represent that interest are the Liberal Democrats and actually Keir Starmer, who is a fascinatingly conservative politician. He talks about, he has to do it, for the sort of the electability of the Labour Party, right, to make them safe. But many of his positions on what he would do with, institutions, be it the civil service or the OBR or the judges, is like protect them. And so. Yeah, I think a lot of the success of, and Partygate feeds into that, right? Because a lot of the issue with Partygates for many voters was this sense that these old-fashioned ideas about how government should look, right, and how people should behave in the office and these great offices of state had been undermined, and it was sort of a really sort of old-fashioned propriety thing. So I think that actually drives a lot of Lib Dem success. And actually that provides actually some quite obvious answers about how you neutralise that. And I think from my conversations with them, like Liz Truss's team are quite aware of that actually one thing they had to do to neutralise the Lib Dems is just shift tone on lots of these issues, including like how special advisors and other officials behave.
Thanks, Matthew. So, Maria, proportional representation. Also, what's your view on a rebrand? Is it the same as a new Prime Minister?
I think rebranding is, similar, I think, to Damian's answer, which is branding and reputations are very important, so I wouldn't touch that particularly if I didn't have to. On PR, I do think it's an interesting question because I think, and again, this is an internal panel kind of question, but I think now most voters would like one if there was a referendum today. I saw somewhere that actually there's now a majority for a reform.
From BSA, I think there might have been.
Yeah, so I think the voters maybe now think that this idea that we have this one party in government and this party is not arguing with itself, but delivering policies, that's been undermined slightly by, as we said previously, this idea that Conservatives are quite divided. They are already, the factions, they have become very, famous, right? So some factions are very well known. So I don't think voters would be confused about the system. I think if we explain the system to them, lots of European countries have different PR systems as well. There are PR systems that actually continue delivering two-party politics, right? Germany is one example where more or less we have that kind of structure. Very similar party system to our system, really, in terms of how it pans out. However, I am not convinced that at today's polling, Labour will introduce it, because it does look like they're going to have a landslide potentially. So why would they change the electoral system if they win with a landslide? So actually, the one question that I wanted to really tackle head on is this question of demographic change, because that's a very interesting one, and academics always wonder about that one, and we spend a lot of time discussing it. And actually this idea that demographic change will be bad for Conservative Party and Republicans in the US actually dates from 1960s. And given that it's not happened yet, I am very skeptical that it ever will, because parties change. And I always say to people who say, oh, but how can this society, which will be much more diverse and much more liberal, how can it vote Conservatives 20 years from now? My answer is always, well, the Conservatives will be also more diverse and more liberal. The parties will change and adapt and adjust. So I don't think Conservatives should worry about demographic change. They should just respond to it as they've been doing all along.
No? Okay, well, we will go, first of all, perhaps to Gideon and Maria on the question on what kind of good poll lead would you hope to be seeing 6 months out, or hope not to be seeing 6 months out for Labour coming into an election to get the kind of majority? You can look at each other.
That's a good question. I'm not going to put a figure on it, partly because...
You get you both to write it down on the back of a card and then we turn them over.
What I'll need is to pull out one of my the calculators and just plug the figures in. I think it's always tricky going from overall share 2 seats, which is my get out on this. I think it's what's interesting is where they are now. Like, it's clearly, there's no question that this is giving Labour a very clear majority. I do think it's interesting that the sort of that to some extent doesn't seem to have filtered through to sort of wider perceptions. I think it's quite easy to see Labour, or rather the Conservatives, losing majority in terms of sort of like the kind of on the vote share numbers. But there was a good article by, I think, Rob Ford, co-author with Maria, in the paper the other day about the kind of the challenges that this sets for Labour to go beyond that into actual majority levels and significant majority levels, because on the one hand, because it basically implies 2 things, and I'm gratuitously stealing his arguments here. It either means you have to make big inroads in Scotland, or it means you have to make really big inroads in the kind of the classic sort of relatively safe Middle England seats that have been Conservative holds for sort of many, many years. And the trouble that places on Labour is, how do you have a strategy and a kind of a platform that appeals to both of those groups, sort of winning off the SNP big time in Scotland, or winning off the Conservatives big time in England, because you'd expect that the thing that you'd have to say would be quite different to win those things. But the Conservatives have got to pull back on some of the losses that they've seen over the last week or so, just to bring that back into play.
Maria, can I have a number? Thank you very much, Gideon. Very considered.
I mean, an election can be won on a 5-point swing, right? So it doesn't have to be an enormous kind of advantage in a poll. Where that poll would be geographically would matter a lot. And my favorite get out on this is turnout, because of course we know that a lot of people, and I think this was already in the presentation as well, and I think you've mentioned your parents were like that they don't actually want to vote Conservative, but they don't want to vote Labour either. So my feeling is that a lot of people will stay home, and how that will distribute. So we can envisage a lot of constituencies where people who normally vote Conservative stay home, and then Labour then can just inch forward with a very small advantage, right? So that might be a recipe for these kind of Middle England seats. I think where Labour also might benefit from a small advantage is what Rob likes to call the blue wall, right? So there's all these very liberal seats around kind of in the south that have really didn't like the Brexit elections and things like that. So I don't think they need a huge advantage, but they do need it quite well distributed geographically. It doesn't help them at all if Manchester votes even more Labour, right? It's the kind of classic example on that.
And then, Damian, how did you feel whenever you saw some of the Labour energy policies being announced? What did you think, the kind of reaction you might see from voters, or indeed people in your own party? How did they react to those?
So I think it's very difficult for opposition parties to get much credit for detailed policy. I think because if you're doing something, sometimes if the opposition party is doing something offering something radically different than what the government's offering, you can get a lot of attention for it. So I think a good example of that would be George Osborne's £1 million inheritance tax pledge in 2007, I think, which was seen as being one of the things that gave the party quite a big bounce out of our conference and persuaded Gordon Brown not to call the general election. I think sometimes opposition parties do strike when it's something really bold and really different and captures people's imagination. Otherwise, it's hard. I think really the government will be judged on its success. I think if its policies are seen to have worked, then it won't really matter what Labour's alternative was. I don't think people thought Labour would have done it better. If the government's policies are broadly seen not to have worked, then I think people probably say, well, Labour would have done it differently. They've got a different plan, and then that may help them win. So I think it's really kind of, I don't think there's very much Keir Starmer can do at the moment to sort of, other than saying he'd do things differently, to persuade people to vote for him. I think, if Labour wins the next election, they'll be on the back of the Conservative Party probably having failed to meet the test that it set itself right now, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to let Gideon just come in with what he thinks the public will think. Did you have a view on that, or were you intimating something else?
No, it's not specific. I mean, I think Damian's sort of right. So it's going to be hard for Labour to kind of come through on that. I think the advantage for Labour is they have picked kind of being able to combine green, more broadly, the idea of being able to combine green policies with economic growth and sort of the infrastructure implications of all that is quite a fertile ground for, we know for the public generally they think that infrastructure needs more attention, and many of their biggest priorities are climate related. So the idea of sort of a green economic plan, I would expect to play quite well.
Thank you.
On that as well, I think also we talked earlier on about sort of how things often take a long time to come to pass. It's quite interesting. I was in Birmingham for the Commonwealth Games. I hadn't been here since before the pandemic. This is a city that has changed. And I think you could look at a city like Birmingham and say, with Andy Street as mayor, with Conservative government, this city is materially different than it was. And I think the things we've done, the Metro mayors, High Speed 2, have been contributing factors of that. I remember hearing a discussion during the Hartlepool by-election, which seems like a political lifetime ago. It was only a year ago, on the radio, and they had the political editor of the Northern Echo on. And he was saying, it definitely feels that this place is more politically important. The North East is more politically important now than it's been for a generation. And I think if people in some of these regions start actually when they come to the election, think, you know what, it may not like everything the government's done, but actually they've done things that have made a real difference to where I live. And I think that could really help us next time around as well. And you could see, where that success is evident, you may see different sorts of results.
Okay, thank you. And then just Matthew, any comments on any of those questions?
Yeah, so I think the politics of this great British power is, what Starmer calls his idea, which is actually is really interesting. Sort of, it seems that the Labour Party is relatively united on it, in that it sort of it appears like it's what's the word I'm looking for, like an approval, a validation of some of the more Corbynite ideas about sort of state intervention, but it's not actually nationalisation, right? They're not nationalising the whole the energy market. It's a state-owned player within it. So it seems like it's a compromise that, with the power of high opinion polls, they can combine behind. But I guess it shows two things. One, which is it's really worth going back and looking at Starmer's speech, where he I say at the beginning that there is a risk that the Conservative Party is vacating two bits of real estate, prudence and state intervention. Starmer basically says that in his speech. And what he does is he does the thing that the Conservative Party did so successfully in 2019, which is to say, when you guys voted for Brexit, you were voting for economic change, and it looks like this. What Starmer said is, when you guys voted for Brexit, you were voting for economic change, and it looks like this. And by the way, Liz Truss isn't offering it anymore. I am, and the policy that this is the policy through which that manifests itself is this sort of Great British Energy. So that policy is a symbol really of effectively how Keir Starmer is dressing in the big baggy clothes of Boris Johnson. What is helping him do that, actually, I think, and I'd love to see the research on this, but the difference between 2019 and 2022 is we have just been through, we've been through one, and we're going through a second crisis that has legitimized and rehabilitated, it would seem, many ideas that were not possible then, right? So 400 and something billion pounds spent through the COVID pandemic, the vast interventions in railways and aviation and medical supplies and whatever to keep the country going, and again these huge interventions in the energy, state subsidies to support people through the energy crunch, the gas crunch in Europe. If you were a Conservative backbencher watching what was happening in COVID, saying I'm not sure I like this because I feel like the ideas of my opponents are being made flesh, and this is going to change how the voters view these sorts of policies in future, you might have a slightly uneasy feeling right now. Perhaps what I'm saying is has the what they call the Overton window, right, of the British public shifted as a result of what was done in COVID? I don't know. Possibly. We'll see. I mean, what hasn't happened in response to the Great British Energy thing is you haven't had this sort of response from newspapers saying, this is back to the 70s. This is absurd. What's the state doing in the energy market? That response hasn't happened, which would suggest that that the space for these sorts of policies and their advocates has opened up a little bit.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'm going to close us here. I'm going to tell you some final housekeeping things, and then I'm going to let each of the panellists, but in a few words, few sentences, say something they're going to reflect on or something that gives them cause for optimism. You can pick which of those you would like to respond to. But just to let you know, if you want this copy of Gideon's slides, you can sign up to a little sheet at the back and we'll send them across to you. And also a second reminder that we have been recording today's session. So if there's anything that you've asked that you want cut out, I don't think there was, it was all very PC, then you can also let Neil or one of the Ipsos team know and we will remove that for you. So I'm going to start with Maria. Either a reflection or something that gives cause for optimism, and then we'll go right down. And Gideon, you have to be optimistic. Try really hard. So Maria first.
Cause for optimism.
Or something you're reflecting on that you've heard.
Okay, so I think maybe the kind of most positive thing that I'm taking away today from this is that the party seems to be very reflective, and I think the kind of narratives that we have around Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and whether they are doing well or not, I didn't have the sense since I've arrived that they've been pushed under the bus and everyone's running to elect a new leader, because I think that would be terrible for the party. So I do think that kind of rallying behind and trying to keep up the edifice going, I think is a good thing.
Thank you. Matthew, a few sentences? Reflection or optimism?
Reflection or optimism. I mean, I guess part of what you're like, the reason why British politics is very different is that one of the things is like the electoral incentives are good, and I think that's sort of reflected in the politics, right? That the incentives are still aligned for governments to deliver and for governments to be sort of moderate and focused and disciplined are still there, and as long as in so much as the Conservative Party might be going through a sticky patch in the polls, that actually to an extent does reflect, nobody is like surprised if the polling at this stage in the cycle and some of the things that have, the difficulties of the Johnson era is being reflected in polling. But the British the incentive to correct course is like still there. I think that when you get into a dangerous pattern is when actually the electoral incentives to do unwise things are and actually like you see that in the Labour Party, right? I mean, Keir Starmer has undertaken a really ambitious and actually quite difficult program to change his party and remove some of the bad things that were happening and to moderate it. And actually the fact that he's being electorally rewarded for that is obviously like really difficult for this party, but on the other hand it does still mean that the feedback mechanisms are working to encourage that and to not to reward radicalization in parties, and that's that has to be good. That is my optimism.
Okay, very nice. Thank you very much. Damian?
Yeah, I mean, what I would take out of this is that I think it's all to play for. And I think that is different than if you go back to the 90s. I mean, with certainly the last couple of years of John Major's government, I don't really think there's anything he could have done very much. I think the kind of people just made their mind up. And what was seen in '97 and again in 2001 was the demonstration of that. And where that doesn't feel like this now, it actually feels like people are very interested in what the government is doing and saying, that they see it's a new government. The government is aligned with the most important issue to the electorate. The question is whether we deliver, and I think that's what I would say. I think for us as a party, to work together to deliver that outcome is our best chance of winning. And I think the research suggests that the electorate will notice if we get it right. I also think as well. I think normally, it's winning from opposition is really hard, and it often takes I think you've got to knock it out the park. I think the opposition. I think mid-term, if it's going to win, has got to be like streets ahead. Because you do see a bit of like consolidation towards the status quo as you get closer to an election, and I don't get any sense that's where Labour is at the moment. I feel to me rather like with Ed Miliband, who Labour did quite well mid-term in the coalition period, but you never really felt that he'd sealed the deal with the public, and I don't think Keir Starmer has earlier either. And again, I don't think this research suggests that he has either.
Okay, thank you. Very optimistic. And then lastly, Gideon.
Yes, so thank you. I thought, in terms of reflections, I really liked the way that Maria was talking about the sort of lessons learned from immigration and sort of the importance of what that means for sort of the wider brand and image of parties. It's kind of difficult to be hugely optimistic because I think probably that the challenge facing you as a party is probably greater than it was a year ago, and it probably is greater than it was a couple of weeks ago. I'm afraid because of the reaction. I think the sort of the way forward for you, and which is what Damian was saying right at the very beginning, is I think at least you have clarity about what you need to do. We know what the public is worried about. The public is worried about the economy and cost of living, and that's what you need to deliver on.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for joining our Fringe event today. And if you would like to stay and join us for a drink, please do. So you heard the clinking of glasses. They were getting ready for you. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.